All right, hello everyone, and welcome once again to the Stellar Open Protocol discussion. These meetings are for discussing core advancement proposals, or CAPs. They're technical specs that suggest changes to the Stellar protocol, and they allow the protocol to advance, to evolve, to meet the needs of the ecosystem. They allow us to add new features to the protocol. These meetings are live streamed so that anyone who's interested can follow along. But again, it's a technical discussion about these very technical CAPs. So if you're watching, you probably want to take a look at the CAPs that are linked to in the show descriptions, along with the mailing list discussions about those CAPs. Today, we're once again discussing the two CAPs we discussed last time. CAP 42, multi-part transaction sets, which again has been revised since our last discussion. And CAP 44, Speedex configuration. There have been a lot of questions on the mailing list about that. So this meeting, again, is just part of the CAP lifecycle. And a lot of open discussion about the CAPs actually happens on that mailing list, again, linked to in the show description. So if you're really interested in joining the discussion, please sign up for that mailing list, and you can sort of see a lot of these questions come in, and a lot of the answers are made there, or they're sort of the questions are brought to this meeting. And so I'm going to sort of end it there. If you want to look up anyone who is in this meeting and find out who we are, you can see our names. I'll let you do that on your own. But in the interest of just keeping things moving along, let's actually just kick off the conversation. So first up, we're going to talk about CAP 42, multi-part transaction sets. This CAP would give validators control over which fee policy to use for individual transactions, included in a ledger. And we actually discussed it previous meeting. It was revised again. And so I'm going to kick it over to Nicolas, who made some of those revisions so that he can walk us through the changes real quick. Nico.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. So yeah, like actually there was the changes I made were actually pretty minor. I mean, expected given where we are. So yeah, like the changes were basically reflecting the what we discussed at the last protocol meeting. So the actual functional change in the CAP is the use of the total or the sum of fee bids as to sort transaction sets. And then the other change is related to questions that that we had last time, and that were also raised on the dev mailing list around what does it mean for clients. In particular, we have documentation today that talks about using like fees, like the fee stats, or the like bidding as much as you can as a strategy, and this needed to be tweaked a little bit. So I put a possible approach to how to do this after this new CAP takes effect. So I don't know if people have time to review it. I imagine actually that maybe Lee, that I think was not at the last protocol meeting, maybe has some questions.
Yeah, I did listen to the last protocol meeting, and I think the conversation actually answered a lot of the questions that I had, and I think you and Nico as well on the mailing list. I think the only comment that I had about the conversation where, you know, the wallets will probably change the pattern that they use to use things like fee bumps. You know, if they need to bump up the fee they're paying. I think realistically for your average wallet, you know, fee bumps will probably not even be necessary. It'll be more like, you know, you try to submit a transaction, it fails, and so you just modify the fee on your current transaction. So you've got a new transaction, and then you sign that again and submit it. The pattern sounds pretty clear. And I think the only remaining question I have is, do we need to discuss what the rollout will look like? Because given that wallets will, you know, there is some change in expectations, you know, what sort of lead time do we basically need to give the ecosystem to adjust or learn about this new process?
Right. So like time, I mean, yeah, like as long as people, like you said, like today, I imagine that most wallets actually deal with like failures, like timeouts of when they submit transactions. But I do agree that there is like some awareness here on this is about to change. You may actually run into, well, you probably want to maybe reduce the maximum bid for wallets that are where people actually set very high bids, which I think there are some. I mean, not very high, but like, you know, like let's say 1 lumen, which is very high for in today's standard. So yeah, so there's probably some communication that needs to go out there that people should actually not put like some very high number that they don't expect to pay, and instead I think maybe align with what actually a lot of wallets seems to be doing, a lot of what the common fee we see, which is more in the 10,000 stroops or something, or 40,000 stroops, which is still sub-penny.
Yeah, I think a lot go with 100,000, which is still.
Yeah, I mean, this is still fine. Yeah, I mean, there are still, even with this new thing, unless people are doing. I think the first wave of changes will probably be around what we discussed earlier in the mailing list. That was make it a little bit more aggressive for like this this kind of trading activity. There is more competition there. So if people are submitting at like 100,000 stroops, they may actually end up paying that with this update. They're more likely to pay that for trading. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. Like I think it's more like like a communication strategy and documentation. I think that we need to work on.
And just in terms of communication strategy and documentation, are we imagining that it is possible that this cap could be included in Protocol 19, or is this already something that might be for a subsequent protocol?
Oh, yeah, Protocol 19. I mean, like ideally, I think we can put it in Protocol 19, which will, I think, at the current pace, it looks like maybe it will be like at the earliest end of May, which is quite a bit of time for people to adjust their wallets or their settings in their wallets.
Yeah, I also think the lead time on using the feature doesn't have to be the same as the lead time on implementing the feature. So if this went into Protocol 19, but we do some surveying and it looks like, you know, that's not a realistic time frame for wallets, like maybe the ecosystem will hold off using the feature for some period of time.
Right, because validators would have to decide to use the feature. And so there could be some readiness check where before any validator use of the feature happens, there's just like a sort of coordination. Okay, that makes sense.
Exactly. Like those things will be enabled by flags on the validator. So yeah, there will be an actual rollout. I mean, like it still means that if we have like after this change takes effect, if we have like one of the validators that decides they want to ignore the flags or enable the features anyways, they can. But that's part of the audit trail that we have in the archives on behavior of validators. Okay.
Are there any questions about where we are with CAP 42? It sounds like we're in a pretty good spot.
I think we left it at a good spot last time, and this addressed the things that came up. So it seems pretty much ready to me. I mean, I have one nit, but it actually doesn't come up in this cap, which is the way we indent our case statements is not compatible with Git diff. So as a general point, maybe we should either like include both a diff and the actual data structures, or we should like reconsider how we indent XDR files. It just so happens that we lucked out, and in this diff, like there's enough context to read it properly. But
Sure. I think that's a formatting issue, right? Which we can sort of talk about offline. Cool. I mean, it sounds like with this cap, it is probably ready to bring to a vote, which I can do I guess we can maybe do at the beginning of the next meeting, since Jed happens to not be here today. In which case, I think we can move on and talk about.
Or we could vote asynchronously. I don't think we need to wait for the next meeting. I mean, I'm ready to vote and to move this forward. So
okay, cool. I'll schedule a vote asynchronously, and then we can share the results publicly, and that way we don't have to wait, and we can sort of push that forward. Cool. So I think then, in other words, Cap 42 is ready to put to the Cap committee for vote, which is super cool, possibly for inclusion in Protocol 19. But now it is time to move on to the next discussion point, Cap 44. So Cap 44, again, is the Speedex configuration cap. Speedex is a new design for essentially a fully on-chain DEX, decentralized exchange, that allows for scaling to high transaction throughput. And we talked about Speedex a fair amount this year. It's part of the SDX.
And more importantly, it gets rid of path payments. So you no longer have to guess intermediary currencies to get the best price.
Cool. Yes. And but for Speedex, we actually decided to break up the implementation of Speedex into several caps. And this first one, Cap 44, is about how Speedex is about who and how Speedex can be configured. And there's been some pretty interesting discussion on the mailing list, but to sort of kick off, I'm going to pass it to John.
Sure. Thanks, Justin. So just to give like a quick overview of like what the discussion on the mailing list has kind of been about, the conversations have kind of gone in like a couple different directions. One question is about like, can we practically derive the set of assets that we can use with Speedex rather than trying to configure it? I think the answer to that at this point is probably no, but we can talk about it more. Then another line of conversation has been around basically the lane of like, okay, let's say that we do the simplest thing and just, you know, do what's in the cap now, just like a voting upgrade system. Can we give some guidelines to the validators that are actionable and predictable so that we don't have arguments in the community about like what should be included? And then a third line of conversation has kind of been about like the more general process types of things, like should we change the way that we do upgrades to make this easier and increase visibility and stuff like that. But none of this has resulted in any changes to the actual proposal yet because it's not remotely clear which direction we should go. So with that kind of overview of where the conversation has gone, maybe we should just like open up the floor and see what people want to talk about.
My 2 cents around the actual like ecosystem stuff around how to make decisions. I don't think this belongs in the cap. As a starting point, I think we could just discuss. You know, validators can discuss over the validators channel on Keybase or the validators channel on the Discord. There's no need to put too much structure around this. Same way that we coordinate protocol upgrades these days. Obviously, this is much more. You know, there will be some arguments and it's good, but I don't think we need to like, let's see what this looks like before we start solving for a problem that we don't actually know what it's going to look like.
I mean, I think the fact that we have this debate and these questions suggests to me that this isn't quite the right design. So I still think that there's multiple stakeholders here. Yes, validators are stakeholders, but so are the asset issuers. And I think that we should give more weight to the asset issuers than the validators. And to the extent that validators should be important, it's only because they're designated as kind of official repositories of information by the asset issuers.
I agree with David, but I don't agree with the result. I think that asset issuers should strive to be validators. I think that's like proper SCP usage, and then they will have a vote. But you know, just by virtue of having like an asset issued, I don't think that's enough to inform the validator network what to do.
But I think as an asset issuer, you are choosing to issue your asset on Stellar because, in large part because you want a liquid market between your asset and other assets, right? And so you have an opinion about which markets are important for your asset, and that's just not reflected by having the validators make this decision.
So what are the mechanics that you suggest for allowing asset issuers to do this, David?
Well, I think that instead of a protocol upgrade, this could be a new type of operation, or a new type of ledger entry, which is the other assets that like you're interested in being in a Speedex with. And once when there's like a kind of mutually satisfactory Speedexes, then you could potentially then you could like sort of create the Speedex, but we should somehow have a way for the asset issuers to express which or rank sort of which assets they're most interested in being in a Speedex with. And we shouldn't necessarily have only one Speedex, right? Because maybe there's multiple disjoint sets of assets, and who are the validators to say like which one is reality, right? Like,
and how are the asset issuers expected to, like this operation? What is it? I think one of the options that we were talking about was like staking lumens, right? Are there other options, or are we just like reverting back to kind of like stake weighted voting mechanisms? The same.
No, it could just be like it could just be a like a ledger, like an account entry or whatever, that you say like which assets you want to be. Like you have trust lines, you could have sort of like Speedex participations where you like specify almost like a quorum slice of assets that you want to have in your Speedex.
But every asset's gonna issue, or like lots of assets are gonna issue these, and there's the protocol still needs some way of deciding like which assets are sort of important, and maybe there's like some kind of, I don't know, max weight matching computation or something going on, but we still probably have to restrict it down to like a certain size or a certain like network objective,
right?
As
so
well
let's
as
say that there should be a configuration parameter which is kind of like maximum size of a Speedex, right? But to me, that seems like the only thing the validators should really be deciding, and then it should be the assets themselves that choose to make a market.
What do you, wait, am I unmuted? Yeah, I am. What about the case of contention? Like, take the most liquid assets on Stellar, which like by like AMM liquidity, we could say would be like I don't know, I think it's like USDC, XLM, Aqua, a couple other assets. Mm-hmm. Like most assets would want to be able to trade with those, because that's where you get a lot of benefit from Speedex, being able to swap with the liquid ones. So let's just say that, like, for the sake of argument, let's say that USDC has like the most liquid markets on Stellar. I don't know if that's true, but let's pretend for the sake of argument. And then basically there's like global contention on wanting to be in the same Speedex as USDC. Mm-hmm. Who do we choose?
Well, that gives USDC a lot of clout. I think USDC should be able to decide, who gets to be in a Speedex with them. Or maybe USDC can be in multiple Speedexes. I mean, that creates arbitrage opportunity, but maybe it's not ridiculous. Maybe we think that the price of USDC is so stable that if it's in multiple Speedexes, who cares? It's the thing that will anchor the valuations of all the other assets.
I think we're putting a bit too much responsibility and weight on the asset issuers in this case. Like, if you look at prior art and other networks, like the issuer just issues their asset, and then there's like a governing body for whatever decentralized exchange.
Yeah, right? I understand. And so I would be into like reducing responsibility, but not reducing sort of like the privilege of like a powerful asset issuer, right? Because when it comes down to it, you know, if USDC still, like, the problem is we might have, it might be that USDC issues their asset and they just don't care. They don't want to think about Speedex. If other people have a use for it, that's great. And so it'd be great if kind of the default were that you could be like recruited into whatever Speedex, but that if it comes down to it, like, you actually have a say in like which markets are more important for your asset. I mean, maybe the problem is I don't have a concrete proposal. So maybe what I need to do in the next week is something is like come up with like a concrete counter proposal for like what this would look like. Or maybe we could kind of, a few of us could meet offline and like brainstorm about this. You know, at the very least, I would like to convince me, maybe what I'm asking for is impossible, right? But at the very least, I'd like to convince myself that it's impossible.
Well, and the other thing, like, and I think that's where I started when I discussed this on the mailing list. I was wondering, like, why does, like, if you want to have issuers, for example, have some say in the composition of Speedex, that should be part of how that set is written, right? For how that set is managed by the validator. I mean, it's governance. So, you know, it's one component. I don't know if it needs to be kind of baked into the protocol in any way, really.
Well, one thing that needs to be baked in is whether there's one Speedex or sort of one or more Speedexes. And I'm very much of the feeling that, you know, the whole kind of Stellar philosophy is like, you know, we're not here to tell anyone what the ground truth is. We'll just let, you know, like, you can have some weird quorum slice, some weird quorum that's an entirely a Sybil attack, and then you can have the real world, and like, if they diverge, like, no big deal, right? And so I would similarly like to be able to have, like, if there's assets that are happy being in a Speedex together, and they're disjoint, then I don't want to be in a position to decide which are the real assets and which are the fake assets. Like, validators shouldn't be doing that.
I guess
At the same time, or sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jeff.
Well, the validators are the one expending the compute to run it, right? So they should have a say at least, I think.
Well, there's fees being collected, and I mean, you know,
yeah, but there's like a non-zero cost of just like running and maintaining the Speedex. That's more than just like you have the assets in your database.
I mean, well, now there's a question of like, should we be compensating validators, or is it cheap enough to run a validator that it's not a big deal? But
well, I'm just worried about like somebody spinning up like 1,000 instances. Or there should be some kind of,
well, we have to price it appropriately, right? I mean,
sure.
I guess
I prefer to use like market-based solutions. Like, we think that this like consumes resources on the network, therefore people should be paying for it. I prefer a market-based solution to a like validators know best type solution, which is kind of what we're doing here.
let me offer you maybe such a, like, it's not quite what you want, I think, but it fits kind of nicely into that space. It's something that I mentioned it both to Jeff and Nico offline. So like the cap currently written is basically like validators control the Speedex asset set. And there was a whole line of questioning, like, could we derive the Speedex assets? Which I kind of was like, I have no idea how to do this. I don't know if it's actually even remotely possible, even feasible. And I presented some examples that are like kind of challenging. But when I was looking at that example, one of the things I realized is like, there's probably a core set of assets that you kind of want in your Speedex, no matter what, like, you know, the world's most liquid assets. You know, I think the example I gave for like the IMF, what's their thing called? The reserve basket thing. I can't think of the word off the top of my head right now. It's kind of like a good representation of that. Or in America, it's like T-bonds and, you know, S&P 500 or whatever. You'd always want those just to have the liquidity from them. But there's a whole bunch of stuff you might want to trade that's not those assets. And so a hybrid solution is like, hey, like
SDRs.
Yeah, SDRs. Thank you. That's the word I could not think of. Appreciate it. And so one like world you could imagine is a world where, like, you know, let's say we have space for 100 Speedex assets. That's like the compute power we have. So then we say like, okay, like the validators can configure 50 and they can configure it however they like using some off-chain governance protocol, whatever, who cares? The other 50 are literally what's in the transaction set. determined by fees, just like any other way you get into the transaction set. So in that case, the transaction set can still have 100 total Speedex assets. 50 are fixed and advanced by the validators. The other 50 are just like literally the ones that appear in that transaction set. If there's 51 in the transaction set, it's invalid. And that basically means like the validators don't have like the truth power. They just have the power to say like, hey, like we think these are the things that everybody always wants, so we can try to give you consistently good prices.
But why don't we? I mean, why speculate that these are the things people always want? Why not have people actually say what they want, right? So I mean, so here's a dumb thing we could do. Okay, let's say there's only one Speedex, but what we could have everybody like vote their lumens for like which assets they most want to see in the Speedex, right? And then we just take this set of assets that has the greatest vote.
Why are we reverting to stake weighted voting? This is
because it's less
anti-stellar philosophy.
No, why is it an anti-stellar philosophy? I mean,
because like we shy away from the idea of more money equals more votes.
Well, I mean, what we're trying to capture with SCP is like some abstract notion of cloud, right? And we want this idea of like, if people are interested in a particular in a particular asset, then and that asset say like designates a validator, then like that validator is going to have more clout in the network. I mean, I agree, like the stake weighted voting isn't perfect, but it's at least a market-based solution. The problem is like you can't have a market-based solution to consensus if you don't already have consensus, or you can, but there's our proof of stake systems, but they have all these other drawbacks, right? Which we don't have. But once we have consensus, then I'd rather have market-based solutions. Like, just because we do trust the validators to maintain consensus doesn't mean we should give them lots of extra power too if we don't have to.
Going back to my original point, I think this is a great opportunity to get stakeholders to actually run their own validators, which is what, like we've been talking about SCP forever as actual stakeholders running validators. This gives them a reason to do that.
I guess that's true, but that it seems a little indirect.
I mean, I agree with Tomer's point here. Like if you're issuing like an asset that's going to be used by everyone, then like you certainly at least should like have a strong incentive to run a validator. If you're not, you're sort of freeloading off of everyone else running validators.
Well, I mean, in an ideal world, you wouldn't necessarily need to run a validator, but you would need to like hire someone to run a validator. So I think like a reasonable like state of the world in like 3 years is that there are various companies like Blockdaemon or whatever who run like sort of validator in anchor in a box type products where you what you could do is you don't have to run a validator, but you pay them to run the validator for you, and they can provide insurance or like sort of whatever else. And there's no reason why if someone just as like probably a lot of people like running their validators on Amazon, right? And so we don't need like everybody to run a physical server. We just need everyone to say, hey, like we trust Amazon to like host our validator, and like and that's fine. But they're at least explicitly saying like, yes, this is the validator that you should trust.
Sure, but there's that contractual relationship there, and through that I can tell whoever is running my validator to vote for my asset to be in Speedex in whatever way, right? I'm still funding them to run the validator.
But the problem is that now let's say that in 3 years 40% of all the kind of assets that anybody cares about have like contracted with Blockdaemon to be their validator, right? Now we still haven't so now like we haven't told Blockdaemon like how to weight like various votes or whatever. So is now Blockdaemon going to be actually the one deciding which assets are important? This is going to be some term of like negotiation in these like confidential contracts they potentially have with their more important customers, or can we do it in an open, transparent, like reasonable and non-discriminatory way where it's just like public how this is happening and the decision is out in the open.
You guys mind if we zoom in on a different aspect of what David was talking about a second ago for a few minutes? Can we zoom in on the one Speedex versus multiple Speedex question?
Sure.
I think like we have not given a lot of thought to this. This did not come up on the Stellar Dev mailing list at all. So I just want to make sure we talk about it at least a little bit. And I think it loops back into the other question as well. I can imagine.
I think that if we come up, it's possible if we come up with an answer to the thing we were just talking about, that it would work more easily if there's a single Speedex. But otherwise, then, all else equal, we should have multiple Speedexes.
I would, my vote is like, I don't find the idea offensive. I'm just not sure that we need to be thinking about this right now. I think that if we do get to a point where it looks like the list of relevant assets is growing to a point where this is like, it's too much for a single Speedex, then we can start, contemplating the idea of adding another one. But it seems like getting started with more than one Speedex, given the shape of the markets on Stellar, I think it's getting ahead of ourselves.
I think that we should absolutely. The thing is, like, we literally have like an XDR diff in front of us, which is actually what we're debating at the end of the day. And so there's absolutely a question of like, should there be an array of maximum length 1 such that down the line we can increase the array size, or should it be sort of hard coded like this to have like only a single Speedex? But again, I think it's like preliminary to make that decision right now until we figured out how we're going to choose what the assets are. But I think like an important kind of safety valve of like ensuring that like we're choosing the assets in a kind of stellar and like egalitarian way and market-based way is to say that, hey, like, if there's like complete disagreement in the world, then fine, like have 2 Speedexes, like let's not decide which one is the Sybil attack and which one are the real assets.
Okay, let's go back to the other thing for 1 second then, since there's people don't seem to want to talk about this. But let me offer you a version of the world where issuers actually have some control. It's like a kind of slightly weird version of the world, but it's not one that we've spoken about yet. So in this version of configuration, the validators don't vote on any asset configuration, doesn't apply at all. Every issuer can like produce a list of assets that they'd like to be in Speedex with them. My guess is that most of those lists will be exactly the same. Or we could even have the validators configure the default list and you only get a different list if you actually put something in. That way, if you're happy with the default, you don't have to do anything. My guess is still that they would all be very much the same, but it's possible they wouldn't. And then the way that we get the actual set of assets in Speedex is we take every asset that appears in the transaction set. You bid for fees to get in the transaction set, so that's very market-based. And then the way we fill out the rest of the asset set is we go over every asset issuer for each of the assets that appears in the transaction set, and we grab the assets from their list. Now, like the reason you have to do that second part is like you definitely don't want to be in a world.
So there's a different Speedex for every block.
Every block would have a different set of assets potentially, but
actually, I almost prefer this. We could even say like you're just not allowed to, when you're forming a block, it's like ill-formed if your Speedex involves more than whatever the parameter number of assets is, right? So any given block can only have a certain number of assets being touched by the Speedex operations, and that could change from block to block.
But hold on, I want to make, before you go, Jeff, I just want to make sure that I'm on the same page as you, David. Do you want the pure anarchy approach where the validator nominating the transaction set chooses all the assets in the set? Or do you want the semi-anarchy approach where they choose the asset, like they choose the operations, and then you go to the issuers to fill out the set?
No, I think actually the idea that like, you have one Speedex per block, and there's some maximum number of assets that can be mentioned in a given block for the Speedex transactions. Like,
I think that this well, so one point, like, why are we talking about filling out the asset set? My instinct is that in almost every situation we're going to be having to prune down to a certain size, not like fill out assets. And then point two, I think, is there's a huge value in having predictability in what the asset that's going to be. Otherwise, otherwise, like maybe, you know, some validator says like I'm going to have this asset, and some other validator says I'm going to have that asset, and I'm like, now I have to start playing games about like where I send my transaction, and then like transactions get, you know, buffered, and then things get front run, and then starts getting really messy.
No,
I think
we'll have a deterministic set of rules. Like it'll be whatever collects the most transaction fees or something.
But I can still game that if it's a deterministic. I had a hard time coming up with like a deterministic rule that wasn't gameable, because I can always submit like transactions that are out of the money or whatever to get my assets in. Maybe I'm just being paranoid here.
I see. So you're saying like you can create standing orders.
Right. I can set an order with like a minimum price of like 1 million or something, and that'll never trade. And manipulate the asset selection rules, which then manipulates the prices. I think.
I mean, I'd like to brainstorm about this maybe offline a little bit, because if there's transactions that are not going to, like, I wonder if you can have how like you can have a post limit order only type order. So like maybe those could be free, and then like maybe we could have people post however and cancel limit orders like for as many assets as we want, and then we actually choose Speedex based on like the depth of the order book or the number of transactions or something. Because in a way, you really want Speedex for the trend to like you want the ones with like the highest number of transactions, because that's where you need the extra efficiency.
I don't know if that's true at all. I mean, like, you should just revert back to the mailing list where I gave like a whole bunch of examples every time anybody mentioned like a derivable set about how you could game them. And I feel so confident that they're all gameable that I'd be willing to wager that for any heuristic that you came up with, I could find a way to game it. I feel pretty confident.
How much?
Not that much, but I still feel pretty confident. So I don't know. David's come up with some pretty crazy stuff before. I feel like he could maybe come up with something that I couldn't figure out how to game, even though I still believe it would be gameable. So that's why I'm not willing to really make a big wager. But my point is, like, any kind of heuristic is probably extremely vulnerable. And like the burden of proof to get me to want to vote for something like that, to want to support something like that, and to want to implement something like that would be convincing me that it's not gameable. And I think that's going to be really, really hard. Just being honest. I think deriving the transaction set is just borderline impossible.
But if there's multiple Speedexes, it could make the gaming not a problem, right? If the way I game the system is by creating a second Speedex, who cares, right?
But we still have to determine the composition.
Yeah, it's not like you're creating an infinite number of Speedexes either. So at some point you have to pick which one of those Speedexes is the.
Well, it's not like you have an infinite number of transactions in a block either. So.
No, but that goes back to it's all gameable.
I think there's just generally value in having the system that sort of runs predictably here.
I agree, but all right. Look, this thing obviously is not ready to move to be accepted today anyway, right?
Definitely
so I feel like now I have a challenge to like at least propose something, or try or figure out why I can't, you know.
I think we should also think about, or sorry, go ahead.
I did want to answer one question that you had actually before, Jeff, which is like, why are you talking about filling out the transaction set? And it goes back to that, like, that example I posted, like, I don't know, it's like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 emails back now on the mailing list. Like, it was like an example using like major world currencies, and like it was a trade for like pounds for yen. But basically, like, the concern I have is like you end up in a world where, like, imagine that, like, you know, imagine that the Russian central bank just like happened to announce for some crazy reason that they were going to raise their interest rate from 9.5% to 20%. Not that this is realistic at all, but like imagine that were to happen. I imagine that there might be a ton of people who wanted to sell their rubles, maybe all for euros and USD. But like if you only have those three assets, you're potentially missing out of a lot of like cross liquidity that you can get from arrow to bro markets, like, you know, where you use the other AMMs to pull more source and sync through so that you can trade more rubles at a good price.
So now imagine that for some crazy reason, USDC doesn't want there to be a very liquid market between rubles and USDC. And so they feel like if they're going to be in a Speedex, they would prefer to be in a Speedex without e-rubles or whatever.
That is a good point. I think at least the asset issuers should have a veto on participation.
Well, either they should have a veto, or they should at least not be in any way complicit. Like it should be like everybody else wanted it and they were overruled or something.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. And also, we've been expressing like asset issuers want good markets with certain assets, and we should also let them express the opposite opinion of I don't want a market with this asset.
I mean, you know, so here's something we could do. We could actually have like Speedex is owned by accounts. So we could say like, look, we're actually going to, you know, instead of a validator, there's just like someone everybody thinks is important, and we're going to let them choose the assets, and they're going to create a Speedex. And if you don't like that, then you can create your own Speedex. And if people start trading on your Speedex, great. If not, then you're irrelevant.
This makes it harder with the liquidity pools. And also, isn't this like more unaccountable than the validator?
Well, it's both more and less. We know who it is, right? There's now like someone who's running the Speedex, and if that person needs to comply with like Russian sanctions, that person can remove the ruble. And if somebody else, you know, if somebody in Russia says, "Hey, you guys suck. I'm going to create a new Speedex on Stellar," you know, more power to them. They can do that. But if none of the other assets want to move over to the new Speedex, then that new Speedex with the ruble, it'll be the ruble trading against nothing, right?
What if we did something with like asset issuers issue preferences and then validators issue like weights to different assets, and then we compute via some like global optimization, like I don't know, max matching or something, based on the expressed preferences or something.
Sounds complicated.
At some point, you're really starting to ask a lot of people to do a lot of complicated things.
Well, you can have a default,
what I'm saying
right?
is simple. What's wrong with my thing? Like, there's just each Speedex has a dictator, but there's multiple Speedexes. So at the end of the day, if the dictator is bad, people will just go to a different Speedex.
And is there in your world an unlimited number of Speedexes that can be created? Because that's my question. How do you stop an evil or just like someone who should not be creating a bunch of Speedexes from creating a bunch of Speedexes?
Maybe they were there. You need some like reserve currency, or you know, you need some reserve balance to do it or something. Or like, I think we're probably fine having like 5 Speedexes, right? You probably don't want like 5 million, but
this has the nice benefit of giving a particular person accountability for like running the price computation, but it also we need to figure out how to bring the liquidity pools. Like, what if there's a competition for like the liquidity pool liquidity?
I think we could just have arbitrage opportunities. I mean, like we hope.
Well, no, but like you can't run this price computation with like if USDC and euros are both in 2 different Speedexes, then there's like contention on the liquidity pool between the 2 assets. And like 2
maybe
trades
an
from
asset,
each one.
maybe the only asset that can be more than one liquidity pool is the lumen, because no one's there to like control the lumen. But otherwise, the asset issuer has to say which liquidity pool they want to be in. So
right. So then we're saying like asset issuers declare exactly which Speedex they're in.
Yeah.
Which is back to the first point that you decided you didn't like, or somebody decided they didn't like it.
There's one additional point that I want to bring into the picture here, which is, our asset issuers, they're active on several networks, and a lot of the activity in the space is kind of like multi-chain. I I think we really need to focus on our differentiators being like high value differentiators, because every time we add something to Stellar that makes it so much more different than any other network index out there, we just make it more challenging for these players to actually be idiomatic players in the Stellar ecosystem. So we really need to make sure that whenever we add something that's different, it's really worth it. Okay, and having asset issuers need to be involved in listing on these centralized exchanges is a big step away from what they're used to doing right now. So I just want to be cognizant about that.
So yeah, I think your point is right, but it's not. So I think what we want to do is we want to give asset issuers the control, but we want to ensure that something good happens to an asset issuer who just doesn't care and hasn't configured it yet, right? Like maybe USDC, like they can't be bothered to learn about Speedex, but everybody else is interested in that asset, and so we need to make sure that that makes it onto like a good Speedex.
Like going like a different direction in this conversation, do people actually care? Like right now, there's no way to really stop your asset from trading against another asset. Like it can happen on the DEX for like basically any asset. Like as long as somebody is authorized to hold your asset, like, I mean, they could trade it for anything they want. So like, why should we give that additional power in Speedex? Like I know that there's some like interest.
Well, because of scalability, right? Only if we could have 1 million assets in a single Speedex, I would say we shouldn't do any of this, right? So it's only, I think, for the scalability problem.
I guess my point is like, there are two kinds of preferences we were talking about. One is the positive preference. Like I'd like to have this liquidity available to me. That's pretty easy. Like my proposal, or rather not to me, but to like people who want to trade my asset, I'd like to have this liquidity available. The reverse position, which is like, I'd like to not have this liquidity available, is not something expressible really on Stellar today. I don't know why we should make that expressible.
Okay. So basically what you're saying is like, you shouldn't let an asset issuer prevent their asset from being traded with a ruble. Anyway, if they really care, what they should do is they should use reclaimable assets. They should sanction, they should KYC their users, and they should go to the appropriate authorities if they have evidence that someone is evading sanctions, and they've KYC'd people. So
exactly.
So okay, I think that's fine, because that's and if they really care, they can use clawback, or they can revoke the trust line to freeze it or whatever.
Exactly. They can basically say like, hey, like you're doing stuff that we don't approve of. Okay. Like it's not in our terms of service. Like so we're going to revoke that.
That's true. And in fact, so really what we should be thinking of is the only reason we're talking about any of this is because we can't put every asset in a Speedex. It's just for scalability. And so
just real quick question about that. That is a functional limit that we can't change. Is that correct? Or is there a chance that we could, through some sort of ingenuity or engineering
research breakthrough? Absolutely. But
there, like the limit is, just remind me, like, what is the reason for the limit?
That's a great question, and Jeff is the best place to answer it.
Right. So there's two things, right? So there's the price computation itself, and then the sort of follow-up correction, linear programming, and basically the runtime of each loop of the price computation is linear in the number of asset pairs, and also you might need more rounds based on more assets. This is especially like you need more rounds of the price computation, typically for assets that are more thinly traded. And then, so there's that scalability problem. And then there's also the follow-up sort of linear programming step. If I just threw a standard linear programming solver at it, I would sort of, that seems to top out at like 50 to 100 assets. And then I was running experiments last night, which, caveat that code that you run right late at night is usually broken, but I was pulling in some other open source libraries that I hadn't played with before, and that seemed to push it to like a few hundred, like 300 or 400 assets. But after that, you're solving some variant of the linear program, which has typically a quadratic or a cubic or something, some kind of runtime. Which sort of, no matter what, you're eventually going to have a prohibitive bottleneck there. There's some things you can play with it and possibly, breakthroughs you can make, but
We're doing some more research on that topic. It's something that me and Jeff and a couple other people around SDF were talking about quite extensively yesterday. And it looks like, it's pretty clear we can do better than Jeff's original estimate of 100, but getting significantly better than 1,000 also probably looks kind of out of reach right now. Even if we can do better than, what Jeff hacked up in the middle of the night yesterday, I wouldn't be confident to say we could do 1,000. That already sounds really high. Maybe we'll find out we're wrong, but 10,000 or 50,000, those are numbers that are not even really in the conversation. They don't even sound remotely plausible within the limits we're working right now. To achieve those kinds of numbers, which would still be a fraction of the total number of assets on Stellar, we'd be, as David said, doing novel, perhaps unprecedented research.
So here's an idea. What if each Speedex had its own order book?
Sorry, what do you mean?
In other words, so one of the problems with having the sort of the dictator, one dictator per Speedex model that I think John brought up is that you could have two dictators, each of whom wants to include both USDC and EURT, right? And so now, what if so now they're sort of competing for the same set of orders, but the person placing the order could also name the Speedex, or we could somehow divvy up the order book between Speedexes.
I mean, this seems fine to me. I think anytime you have multiple Speedexes with the same assets, you're going to fragment liquidity. But
actually, what if you just run them in different phases? I mean, if we only have 5 Speedexes, right? If we run the Speedexes serially, then we just have some random order. You do the first Speedex, and then you just use whatever's left over the order book to do the second Speedex, and then the third Speedex.
My real concern is just I just really feel like the returns of doing this are just really marginal. My intuition, and my intuition has been wrong many times before, so I'm not claiming that what I believe is necessarily right, but my guess is all the really high quality liquid assets appear in the first Speedex, whatever you want to label this first Speedex in some ordering.
No, I'm not saying that the first Speedex might be the one that executes second, right?
I understand. But what I mean is basically the first Speedex is the place where you want to trade and it has all the value, basically.
Right.
The first in terms of the liquidity ordering. And then all the second tier assets trade with each other, but because they're all low liquidity assets, the aggregate liquidity is really low. There's no good asset in there, no super liquid asset in there to provide a lot of liquidity. And then anything that doesn't make it into that one has even worse liquidity globally. Right. And so basically it's you have the VC thing where it's the first thing has to do better than all the other things. The second thing has to do better than all the other things except for the first. Is there any value?
Right. So that's why I think
tail?
There wouldn't be more than 5 Speedexes, right? But it's a way to I just don't want to put validators in a position of having to justify particular assets. Imagine that there's a really popular asset and it turns out to be a fraud, and you were operating a validator and you voted to include that asset in the thing, right? So now are you liable for that? You could have chosen a good asset and you chose to make it easier for people to buy this fraudulent asset. What's your responsibility there?
I'm not a legal expert, but probably very little. I don't think that American stock exchanges get listed when American stock exchanges get sued over listing.
Well, no, but that's a good example. The stock exchanges have relatively stringent requirements for companies to get listed, and when the companies don't comply, they get delisted, right? So we're now if we use that analogy, now validators are actually required to police these assets, right, and to potentially make sure that they're disclosing things and whatever, because otherwise they bear some responsibility.
That is a good point. And it's also possible we would get validators just not paying attention and voting no on everything, so they don't have this liability. And then we wouldn't have any assets in Speedex.
So at this point, we only have 2 minutes left. And I think what I want to make sure that we do is it seems like there are some actions that need to happen between now and the next time that we meet to move this along. And principally, David, I think it falls to you, because it sounds like you want to come up with some sort of concrete explanation of another way to determine,
or at least
this
try.
asset list. Try, yeah. Is it so that's sort of something that you're going to work on. Is there anything else that needs to happen after this meeting in order to keep the conversation going forward? Or is it primarily we should
move all the extension units to the top of the structure? I'm never going to vote to approve another proposal in which the EXT fields aren't like the first one in the structure, but that's not a huge ask I have.
Right, do some housekeeping. We should do some housekeeping. But for the Speedex configuration proposal, like I believe from everything I've heard, it's time to see if David can come up with an alternative concrete proposal.
Right, and maybe we can meet offline or something. Maybe John and Jeff, we could like talk at some point.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Later this afternoon or what. But,
and likewise, I actually have some like intrigue about the proposal I made quite a bit earlier about like the, take the stuff from the transaction set and then use the issuers list to fill out the set. I'll write something up on the mailing list about that too, to kind of give like a full overview of how that would work and why I think it's not a terrible idea. I think it fits somewhere in between some of these other proposals and David's proposals. So
great.
Anything else people want to see?
All right.
Perfect.
Sounds
so
good.
We'll look forward to that stuff. And obviously the sooner that you can get it done, ideally, if there's something for people to read with enough time in advance of the meeting. So like, there's just, the meeting is in 2 weeks.
2 weeks? Okay.
Yeah. That's ideal. All right, cool. Thanks, everybody. Thanks everyone for watching. If you want to follow along, there's a link there for the Stellar Dev mailing list. That's where these discussions happen asynchronously. So please join and watch the discussion unfold and contribute if you have good ideas. Everybody, thanks so much. Bye.